Hello there, Hidden Hermit, and as you can see I've got a whole yellow vibe going on here because today we're talking about Gemini. Okay, so Gemini is the third sign of the zodiac, roughly going from May the 20th, 21st to June the 20th, or 21st. I love this card. You've got twins there, but hey. So here's my Gemini setup. I've got some Nag Champa incense burning. It's a really heady smell. It kind of goes to my head a little bit, but in a good way. This is the glyph for Gemini. Thank you for focusing, Mr. Camera. And yeah, I've got some a nice piece of, this is called apatite, and yeah, it's pronounced like that, not spelt like that. Of course, it's not going to focus now, is it? Now let's give up. And I've also got some blue lace agate. Of course, these are gems and stones that are associated with Gemini. Over here I got some howlite. Now howlite's usually got a blue tinge to it. I wish this would focus. If I just did, no, forget it. But this will. This is some purple howlite. I love this. It's such a great wee stone. Yep, so there's my Gemini setup. So yeah, Gemini. What can we say about Gemini? Gemini is, of course, an air sign. Here's some air. I don't quite understand why this card is so blue. Maybe it's this whole sky clouds thing going on. That's pretty cool. In tarot, of course, air is symbolized by the suit of swords, and the meanings pretty much are the same. So swords and air are about intellect, communication, things to do with the mind, things that come from the head, if you like. The tarot card associated with Gemini is tarot key number 6, the Lovers, which is a complicated card with a strong history. We'll get onto that in just a moment. The planet associated with Gemini is Mercury, and here's Mercury looking very mercurial, strangely enough. The important thing about Mercury is it travels around the sun really quickly. 88 days it takes to orbit the sun, so speed is also another thing that's associated with Mercury, as well as the attributes to air, so things to do with the mind, communication, ability, and also trickster, which sounds kind of familiar if you know your tarot cards, because Mercury is of course represented by the Magician, one of my favorite cards, something I like to aspire to, in a positive sense, I would hope. So Gemini, little brief history about Gemini. Gemini is a Latin word that means twins, and here is you can't really see it on this card, and this is a new card, new props. I love my props. Showing the constellation of Gemini, and notably these two stars here. This is Castor, and this is Pollux. This is Castor. This is Pollux. And that's from the Greek myths. Now, going back through antiquity, there are a lot of cultures that have identified these two stars as a pair. The Persians named it the two figures. The Anglo-Saxons called it Gay Twazan, the twins. It's been called in other cultures, and Gemini actually, the constellation, has probably got, I mean, when you read up about it, there's so much, there's so many stories, but a pairing is always a theme, if you like. It's also been called the two infants, the two angels. Early Christians tried to rename it Adam and Eve, and interestingly, a lot of the figures are always naked. I mean, these dudes here are naked, but then again, you know, there was a lot less clothes back in the day. The Egyptians called it the two sprouting plants, and early Romans wanted to rename it Romulus and Remus, the two twins that founded Rome. Now, just a little bit of background about the mythology. Castor and Pollux, Gemini is called the twins, but they weren't strictly twins in the sense that we know it. They were more like brothers. They shared the same mother, which was Queen Leda of Sparta. Castor's father was King Tyndareus, and Pollux's father was Zeus. Zeus got a bit naughty, as he did. Zeus was a bit rapey every now and then, and this is the story of him turning into a swan and well, they say seduce, but it was a little more insidious than that. Zeus, he deserves a slap at the very least. But anyway, they got up to all sorts of adventures, these two brothers, these two twins that were devoted to each other. But there are so many stories, too many stories for this video. Notably, they were on the Argo with Jason, so they did a lot of sailing around, and they do become the sort of patron stars of sailors. The constellation of Gemini has been used throughout maritime history as a great navigational tool. The overriding myth, however, I like is when Castor died or was dying, Pollux, who was destined for immortality, being the son of Zeus, gave up half his immortality so that they could hang out for the rest of time, which is lovely. Which is why Zeus threw the constellation of Gemini up into the sky. And very briefly, I'd just like to say that Castor, it appears as a blue star, but it's actually 6 stars. Who'd have thought it? You can't really tell with the naked eye. There is speculation that these 6 stars, there are 2 binary systems. They're going to travel so far apart from each other by the end of the 21st century that you'll be able to make out 2 different separate entities, if you like. I'm not going to live that long, so I'm just going to take that on face value. Pollux is a yellow giant, and they're both sort of between 45 and 55 light years away. So in astronomical terms, they're like our neighbours. So there you go. So also Gemini rules the 3rd house in astrology, which again is relating to messages, communication, and also siblings, cousins, relatives. The houses have whole lists of things that they're associated with, but the overriding feature of the 3rd house is communication, much like the suit of air, much like Mercury. So there's a lot of synchronicity in the as with most of these things in astrology and tarot. So Geminis get a bad rap in astrology, I feel. Geminis and Capricorns especially, but there are some sort of reasons for this. Look at how smoky it is. Yeah, like I say, this is really heady stuff. I quite like it. But yeah. Anyway, Geminis. So if you have Gemini as your sun or as your ascendant, and they're almost as important as each other, and to a lesser extent if you've got the moon in Gemini, you may recognize some of the following traits. So Gemini is a masculine positive sign. It's metal. Associated metal is of course Mercury, of course. As I've said, Gemini, swords, air, mind, intellect, communication. So Geminis are seen to be considered as clever, youthful, quick-witted, chatty, cheery. They're up to date, meaning they always want the new things, the new phone, the new car. They're into the new bands. They go and see the movies the day they come out, etc., etc. They always have a multitude of interests. They've always got their fingers in all sorts of different pies. They can be excitable. They have 2 of everything. Let's have 2 of everything. Let's have 2 Geminis here. Interestingly, this is the 4th time I've tried to do this video. There have been lawnmowers and me forgetting things. I forgot the court cards, and persistent bell ringing from a misplaced pizza. And of course 4 is 2 plus 2, or indeed 2 times 2. I don't think that really means anything, but who knows. This could also go very wrong, but never mind. Yeah, so Geminis are also, they have 2 of everything, apart from friends. They have loads of friends, and that's possibly because of some of their most admirable traits is they're very, very perceptive. They're very observant. They're great listeners because they're always hungry for knowledge. They always want to take in everything that's going around. Geminis are generally happy when they've got a lot to do. Some of the negative attributes of a typical Gemini are they can be seen as fickle. They do have a dual nature, and they can be deceptive because of it. One term that's thrown around willy-nilly is they can be considered to be two-faced, which I think is a little unfair, because on the face of it, I think everybody has an element of two-facedness in them. So yeah, that's a little bit unfair, but because their minds are always wandering, because they're always trying to do something else, and that can manifest as being two-faced, if you like. They can be seen as narcissistic. They can appear so chatty that they may appear to talk before they are thinking, although that's not strictly true, because, you know, Geminis do have an inherent intellect and mental clarity about them. They're very good at singing their own praises. and they can be seen as emotionally shallow. Although that, again, that's not true. It's just because they move on really quickly. Geminis are good at things like they're good at speaking. They're good at articulating themselves. There's a lot of dramatic arts, and in fact, it has been noted on some videos that there are a lot of very successful rappers that are Geminis. Tupac is one example. And I just wanted to mention, and I don't really want to single anybody out or anything like that, but I just wanted to mention Kanye West. Kanye West is a Gemini, obviously, otherwise I wouldn't be mentioning him. His birthday's on the 8th of June, which is slam bang in the middle of Gemini season. Now, I see him as a typical Gemini. I really do. Mostly because, well, I mean, just look at him. Look at what the guy does. He's a talented musician and a gifted producer. He always likes to nurture new talent, so there's that business side of him. He's high up in his fashion businesses as well, and he has embraced that celebrity culture. So just on that, there's 5 things there that he's very, very good at and that he does very, very well. And yet, on the other hand, in the words of Barack Obama, he's a bit of a jackass. He says the craziest things, and when the world's like, oh my God, did you hear what Kanye just said? Oh my God. He doesn't care because he's already moved on. I'm not trying to defend him in any way. I'm not trying to sort of sing his praises. It's just the way I see it. He's a typical Gemini. Now, I haven't looked at his birth chart, but I wouldn't be surprised if he had a double dose of Gemini in there, maybe an ascendant, or maybe a waxing moon in Gemini, or maybe, you know, Mars or Jupiter in Gemini. And like I say, I don't know. I'll go out on a limb and say that Saturn probably is not in his Gemini. But yeah, typical Gemini is Kanye. So let's move on. The tarot key associated with Gemini is the Lovers. And you're obviously going to see straight away that you've got 2 things. Now, the Lovers is considered by a lot of readers as a card of romance, although that doesn't really do it justice, I feel. It has a very interesting history. If I was to pull out an example of the Marseille deck, it was originally called the Lover, singular, and you have this guy in the middle here who's between 2 women, and a lot of people have interpreted that in many different ways. Is this a matriarchal mother figure who's handing him off to a younger potential spouse? Is he making a choice between these 2 women? Either or, really. I mean, if you're reading the cards, you're obviously going to put it into whatever context is necessary and appropriate. Also, you do have the familiar theme on some of these cards, and let me just pull out the Night Sun here. So you have this, so you've got the Night Sun and the Marseille. You got this cherub with a bow and arrow, and a lot of people suggest that it's Eros. If it is, then it would very much be geared towards that romance. However, the Waite Smith, it isn't necessarily Eros, it's some sort of angel, some sort of divine thing going on there. And if we were to look at the Hermetic, I can't hold so many cards, that's ridiculous. If we was to look at the Hermetic deck, this tells us that the Golden Dawn title of this card is the Children of the Voice Divine. So there's a suggestion that these 2 people are able to receive messages from the divine. And it's not because they're in love, but it's because that their minds are so in sync. And it's very much their minds as well. I mean, if there was a romantic connotation to the Lovers, then that would suggest it was more of a soul bonding. But, you know, I would lean towards the 2 of Cups more for that sort of thing. The important thing is that these 2 people, whether they be lovers, brothers, or twins, or just generally 2 people, it could be a platonic relationship, but their minds are so in sync. You know, they finish each other's sentences, they know but they just instinctively know what the other one's up to. Going back to look at the Hermetic deck, and you have the myth of Perseus slaying the I can't remember, I've just gone out of my mind, but there's Andromeda. They of course were a very, very famous couple. Now it could also be said that the 2 people on the Waite Smith card are Adam and Eve. Who knows? if we go back to the Night Sun, that's the Emperor and the Empress. Again, another famous couple, especially if you like tarot. If we were to go even further, here's the top deck, and I'm going to pop these down here. So the top deck's got everything going on in here. So up in these corners, you've got Adam and Eve, potentially, maybe. Potentially the Emperor and the Empress, which would make sense. And indeed, down here you've got two brothers. They could very well be twins. Interestingly, one is of colour and one isn't, which I think, I mean, a lot can be said about Aleister Crowley's bad boy attitude, but he certainly wasn't in any way racist, sexist, or homophobic. So, you know, all credit to him. I don't know how significant that is, but again, all these pairs, they're in synchronicity. I also quite like about the top lovers is this magus type figure. Is it a magician? I don't know. Is it a hermit? Is it a hierophant? But is it the divine? I don't know, but he looks really cool. He's got a Gandalf vibe going on there. So yeah, the lovers. Now, you could talk about the lovers and the history of this card and the images of this card for ages, but that's going to be another video one day, I would hope. So, Mercury, as I have always said, Mercury is of course the Roman name for this particular deity or god. The Greeks called him Hermes, and the Egyptians called him Tot. And they all have the same sort of vibe. So, you know, this magician figure in the tarot very much kind of apes the vibe of Mercury, Hermes, and Tot. He's someone who's very able and competent. He has all the tools that he needs to achieve whatever he wants. And of course, in the magician, you have the wands, the chalices, the pentacles, and the swords, the suits that are in front of him. Also, you have that hermetic principle of as above, so below, which is attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, which, if we were to look at the hermetic deck, and I believe that's who that is meant to be. That's Hermes Trismegistus. He may very well have, that could be his emerald scroll, who knows. You've also got an image of Hermes, or indeed Mercury. I think it's more Hermes, because he's got the Cadillus, although, you know, they're very, very similar. There you have the glyph for Mercury up there. The interesting thing about the glyph for Mercury is it's somewhat sexless, because you've got, it's kind of a mix between Taurus and Venus. Not that Taurus and Venus are informing any of this in any way, but I think it is generally accepted that the magician, that Mercury in astrological and tarot views could be male or female, or indeed definitely not either, or definitely both. I don't know. So yeah, all the same themes. I've always wondered what this candle's for. Is it just there for decoration, or does it mean something? I don't know. Answers on a postcard. Yep, let's go with Tot next. And again, you have that Hermes, Mercury, but mostly Hermes, I would imagine, vibe. And again, it's a really striking card. You have all these lines sort of signifying that speed. Mercury, as I've already suggested, takes 88 days to go around the sun, so you got that sort of sense of speed and action and ability. I really like the smug look on his face as well. I don't know why, but I do. I just like it. Cracking card. And finally, I love this magician. Now, the magician is a cracking card in all decks. I don't think I've come across a magician I didn't like, but of course, here's the Night Sun, and check this guy out. Look at him, he's awesome. Behind him, he has a Seal of Solomon. He appears to be in some sort of trance. I don't know if I can get closer yet. Here we go. That's awesome. He appears to be in some sort of trance, and he appears to be levitating, which is cracking. Not only does he have the sword, the pentacles, the chalice, and the wand in front of him, but he's got all the alchemical symbols on his, I don't know what that is. Just a sort of a skimpy robe. I don't know. You've also got the 777 here, which alludes to Crowley's work of the same name, which is basically just a book of tables and correspondences. Again, a tool. So I just love this card. Love this card. So yeah, that's Mercury and the Magician. So now we move on to the 3 decans of Gemini. As I've said, Gemini runs from roughly May the 20th to June the 20th, depending on what year. Those 30 degrees are divided into 3. And because Gemini is the mutable air sign, meaning it comes at the end of a season, and Gemini is the last season of spring, it's heralding the beginning of summer, we take the last 3 cards of the suit of swords, which are the 8, 9 and 10 of swords. And let's face it, they're not pretty cards. They're not pretty cards at all. Here's the 8 of swords in the Waitsmith, and you have an image of a woman. She's blindfolded and bound, and she appears to be it's not explicitly obvious by the image, but I think the general consensus is that she's imprisoned by these 8 swords, which I think is important. Now, the first decan of Gemini, which will run from May the 20th to May the 30th, is ruled by Jupiter. So if you can imagine that Jupiter is the Wheel of Fortune in the tarot, and Jupiter is so far from his home in Sagittarius, is in fact 180 degrees, and that's what's known as being in its detriment. So Jupiter, the actual benefic, and if I was to bring out here's the night sun, there's the glyph for Jupiter up there, there's Gemini, and again you have this woman here, and she's blindfolding herself, which I think is so profound. She is definitely imprisoned by these 8 swords. It's so profound because this vibe of entrapment, of fear and helplessness, could very well be self-inflicted. So you pull the 8 of swords, and it kind of suggests you're in some sort of pickle. It kind of suggests that you've been bound in some sort of way. And it's very much because Jupiter's so far away from his home. And if I was to bring out the Hermetic deck, the Golden Dawn title of this card is the Lord of Shortened Force, meaning that Jupiter, in its glorious, benefic magnificence, so far from home, is just so diminished that he just doesn't work, basically. Nobody's happy. And I apologize for all Geminis, but these decan cards are really harsh. They say that there are no good or bad cards, but come on, let's face it. Who wants to be the 8 of swords? If we were to look at the top deck, it doesn't really give us any more new information, but you do have these purpley red Jupiter vibes. Again, it's a really striking image, and you have 2 swords that are imprisoning the other 6 swords. Different array of swords, which is nice. So again, you get that vibe of doing this to yourself. Crowley named this card Interference. So if you can imagine Jupiter, the Wheel of Fortune, coming up with the lovers as a pair, riding that Wheel of Fortune, they're going to get separated, they're going to get thrown around, and much unhappiness will ensue. Also, on top of that, the decan ruler, I've remembered, that's awesome. The decan ruler for the first 2 decans of Gemini is the Knight of Swords. So if you can imagine the Knight of Swords, the Lovers, and the Wheel of Fortune all chucked together in a churning mess, and yeah, people are just going to be flying around all over the place. Oh well. Moving on, before we get too scared. Unfortunately, it doesn't get any better. Here is the 9 of Swords. And again, a very, very striking image. Some people have suggested that that's a woman. I think it's either. I think it's a person. And they're in bed, and they're in complete despair. Despair, isolation, fear, grief, and shame are some of the keywords for the 9 of Swords. But again, this is all to do with it's in your mind. You haven't necessarily done something to bring you shame. You're not necessarily facing a situation to really incite genuine fear, and that is because the planetary rule of the second decan of Gemini is Mars. Let's bring out the Night Sun's a bit of an enigma. Let's bring out the top one. Now, Crowley named this card Cruelty. So Mars isn't Mars is quite strong when he's going around the zodiac, but as we know, Mars is the god of war. The tarot card that symbolizes Mars is the tarot. Did I say tarot? Good. Yeah, the tarot card that symbolizes Mars is the Tower. So if you can imagine the Tower coming up with the Lovers, it's not going to be good. It's not going to be good at all. The Tower, you know, a lot of people say the Tower means change and rebirth, but it also means destruction and war. That's just the way it is. I'm sorry, I didn't make the rules. And this card is great. You got these sort of yellow drops coming down that turn into, well, it could be blood dripping off the end of the swords there. And I think what the meaning is here is Mars. He comes into the second decan of Gemini and he realizes that actually he doesn't need to exert his force in a physical sense, but you can also play harsh games with your mind. Here is the Nine of Swords in the Hermetic deck. The Golden Dawn called this the Lord of Despair and Cruelty, which is just harsh, isn't it? It's just harsh. Here's the Night Sun, and it's slightly different here. There is a different vibe going on. You have these 9 swords impaled into the ground. You have this interesting flower that's growing through, and it's kind of sort of exalted there. And I kind of think this suggests to me that the Nine of Swords is all about all those negative feelings, but you're bringing it on yourself, much like the 8. It's all in your mind. So there is hope. All you've got to do is perhaps just get over yourself a little bit. I don't know. Harsh card. Moving on. Unfortunately, it's all downhill from there. Here is the Ten of Swords. And it's one of the most shocking images in the whole tarot, I think, because let's face it, can you seriously believe that guy is still breathing? He's got 10 freaking swords stuck in him. And here's the Night Sun, very much the same. This guy is still standing. How? I do not know. If that was me, at the very least, I would be dead, I would have thought. So the third decan of Gemini, which will run from roughly the 10th of the 11th of June to the 20th of June, is ruled by the Sun. Now, the Sun usually, again, much like Jupiter, is usually a joyous, cracking thing to happen to you wherever it ends up in the zodiac. However, the Sun's just 2 signs away from his home in Leo. So I kind of get the feeling that the Sun's just got one eye on his natural home and another eye on moving out of it. Which means that if we were to go to the Hermetic deck, it's called the Lord of Ruin. So the Ten of Swords gives some of the keywords are exhaustion, giving up, pain and betrayal. Ruin is probably the harshest word that you can attribute to a piece of card. And yes, the top deck says much the same thing. Now, it is a 10, so that the 9s generally give you a sense of some sort of completion. So the 10 is moving on from that. And I think that's what the Sun kind of informs us. He may have one eye on Leo, and he may have another eye on moving out of Gemini. But, you know, you've done all this. All the bad stuff has happened to you, so it is now time to move on. Do you know what? I forgot the court card, didn't I? I forgot the court card for the 9. But unfortunately, it is the Nine of Swords. So again, Knight of Swords again. So they're the first 2 decans. The decan ruler of the third decan, informed by the Ten of Swords, is the Queen of Cups, which may not make much sense. However, if you were to reverse the Queen of Cups, I think that gives you a much better sense of this despair and ruin. And you know, it's the last decan of Gemini. The next sign of the zodiac is the water sign of Cancer. And so you get your mutable Gemini energy with a mutable Gemini watery decan at the end there. I will talk more about the Queen of Cups in Cancer, hopefully, if I remember those pesky court cards. So yeah, the Ten of Swords. It's not a pretty image. If you're an intuitive reader, how would you spin that in a more positive way? And I've already said that, you know, you have. I like to think that the sun's there and it's burning everything away. Perhaps, who knows? Again, I'm going to apologise for all Geminis. The 8, 9, and 10 of Swords, they're not pretty cards. In fact, the suit of Swords in general is a harsh suit, because it is air and it is that sort of mind, logic, and reason. There are cards there that make perfect sense when you really think about them. And it's not the time to talk about the 3 of Swords, and it's not a time to talk about the 5 of Swords either. We're talking about these ones, and yeah, they're just harsh. So that's Gemini for you. I get the feeling I'm forgetting something again, but it's because I've done this 4 times and I just can't remember. So I don't know. I think I'll just end on there because my incense is burnt out and I probably want to light some more. So thanks again for watching as usual. I am the Hidden Hermit. I hope you have a lovely day.